back to the Louisville and Lexington ADU conference. We're excited to be joined by Abdul-Malik, who is the chief appraiser for A Quality Appraisal in Portland, Oregon, which means they are 3 hours behind us. So we appreciate you getting an 8 o'clock start here and kicking off your morning with the folks in Louisville and Lexington. Abdur has extensive experience in appraisal for ADUs in that market, and I'm sure there's a lot of interesting takeaways we're going to get that will be pertinent to both Louisville and Lexington. So at this point, I'm going to step aside and let Abdur take over. If you have questions, please make sure that you put them in the question and answer the Q&A feature that we have. You can start that immediately as they come to mind, and we'll be keeping an eye on those. And at the conclusion, we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. And we might not be able to get to all of them. You all were great with questions last time, but we'll get to certainly as many as we can. So we appreciate you being here. Abdur, take it away.
Okay, let me go ahead and share my screen. So as spoken, I'm Abdur-Malik. I'm an SRA, ASA, AGA, HMS. I'm with A Quality Appraisal. And this morning, we're going to be talking about accessory dwelling units, valuation tips from an appraiser. So just a little bit about me. I'm a certified residential appraiser. I'm licensed to appraise in Oregon and Washington. I'm a board member of the ASA Portland, Oregon chapter of Real Property Appraisers. I am designated with the Appraisal Institute. That's the SRA part. I'm designated with the ASA. I'm a home measurement specialist, and I'm an accredited green appraiser with Earth Advantage. Done some blogging at appraisersblog.com, and I spent a couple of years working for a nationwide appraisal management company. I actually really valued that experience because that allowed me to see reports from all over the country, including the East Coast. I got to see reports in Alaska, Hawaii, where appraisers are required in some parts to put in lava flow maps. So I got a wide angle lens on the appraising world with that job. I'm an advanced Excel user. I've also dabbled with the R programming language and MS Power BI. And I am a realtor with the Portland Metropolitan Association of Realtors. So here's a quick overview of what we're going to discuss. We're going to focus in on the definition of an ADU, and that's very important when it comes to the valuation of these properties. We're going to talk briefly about the different types of ADUs, and then the meats and potatoes, the approaches to value, searching for ADUs, some tips that can be helpful in your market, in your area. And then we're going to look at some case studies in ADU valuation. It's always good to see concrete examples of findings in markets. So let's first start with the ADU definition. Definitions are so important. Now, most of you know that the GSEs, such as Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they set guidance for appraisers when it comes to the valuation of properties. So Fannie Mae in particular produces something called the Selling Guide. It's a 1,000-page document, and it does speak about accessory dwelling units. And here's their definition. It's an additional living area independent of the primary dwelling unit and includes a fully functioning kitchen and bathroom. Some examples may include a living area over garage and basement units. Whether a property is defined as a 1-unit property with an accessory unit or a 2-unit property will be based on the characteristics of the property, which may include, but are not limited to, the existence of separate utilities, a unique postal address, and whether the unit is rented. Here's the key for appraisers. The appraiser is required to provide a description of the accessory unit and analyze any effect it has on the value or marketability of the subject property. So that's what they're hiring us for. But the key takeaway here is that it has to be independent. Now, how does that compare with the Louisville definition? So this was taken from their website regarding ADUs. It's very similar to the Fannie Mae definition. It says an ADU is a smaller secondary dwelling unit located on the same lot as a principal dwelling. ADUs provide complete independent living facilities, which at a minimum includes permanent provisions for living, sleeping, eating, cooking, and sanitation, which are accessed independently. So essentially, if you have an ADU and you have a tenant, let's say, living in that ADU, you should be able to theoretically go months without interacting with this person. They don't need to come through any common area that you own. Basically, they're just slipping a check under the door to pay you for the rent, and that's it. It should be completely independent. Now, Louisville's ADU standards and zoning allowances only permit 1 ADU for each single family lot. So if you show up to a property and there's 2 of them, well, that's a problem. You may not have, one of them may not be considered an ADU. Now, I hope I got this correct. I was looking at the ordinance and it says that an ADU size may be up to 800 square feet, very similar, by the way, to Portland, where I'm from. And 30% of the gross, or it could be 30% of the gross floor area of the principal structure, whichever is greater. It's a little different. We have a hard cap in Portland at 800 square feet, but it does seem in your area, there is a possibility that an ADU might be just a bit bigger depending on the principal dwelling. Now, they do have some restrictions. You can't use these for short-term rentals unless they give you a permit for that. So they don't want Airbnbs, apparently, or at least they want to make sure it's regulated and they're aware of it. And you do have what's known as an owner occupancy requirement. So the owner has to be in either the principal dwelling or the accessory dwelling, and that's going to impact the income approach to, to valuation. So apparently they don't want any absentee landlords. In Portland, we actually do not have that restriction, so you could rent out both units. Now let's talk very briefly about the different types of ADUs. So you have detached units, you have garage conversions, you have attached units, basement units, you can have a carve-out unit. So what this means is maybe it's a portion of the basement, a portion of the main floor, a portion of an upper level. So it can get a little bit creative there. And this is where sometimes confusion comes in because a property can be very hard to classify as to whether or not you have kind of like a guest quarters or guest suite or an actual ADU. And it gets especially tricky if the ADU is nearly the same size as the main house. I actually recently appraised a property where that was the case. Now, some appraisers may just say, hold on a second, can't I just call this a duplex and be done with it? No, you can't. Richard Hager, some of you may recognize that name. He's an SRA who's a national instructor for appraisers. He likes to say that appraisers need to do a righteous highest and best use analysis. So even if both units are rented, and as I mentioned before, Portland permits that, even if they're both rented, valuing the property as a duplex or multifamily property in some cases may result in a diminution of appraised value. So you have to be really careful to analyze a property from both perspectives. And you really want to be careful if the status of the property is ambiguous. As a reminder, appraisers are required to do what's known as a highest and best use test. And there's 4 principal ways to look at it. Is it legally permitted? Is it physically possible? Is it financially feasible? Is it maximally productive? Most appraisals these days are done on what's known as a 1004 form. Fannie Mae produced that some years ago, and they're in the process of revising that form. But one of the criticisms of that form is that there's just this measly checkbox on one page about highest and best use. An appraiser should be doing a deep dive into highest and best use analysis, particularly when it comes to ADUs, because misanalyzing a property from a highest and best use perspective is what a lot of appraisers find themselves in hot water for with their state board, or having maybe an errors and omissions claim filed against them. So we don't want to do that. In many cases, it can be very easy to say, okay, yeah, a property like this is a duplex, it's symmetrical, there's no dominant unit, clearly a duplex. And then in this case, yeah, we got a principal dwelling, we got a smaller detached dwelling. It's pretty clear that that's a single family home with an accessory unit. But other times we're kind of scratching our heads. So when that happens, stick to definitions. Definitions will save you and guide you. In general, an ADU should be clearly subordinate to the main dwelling, but if you stick to the dwelling of what is an ADU, you usually won't go wrong. And sometimes things do fall outside of the definition, and if it does, that's okay. It doesn't mean that this structure doesn't have value, but just don't call it an ADU, because financing rules can differ depending on whether or not it meets the test. So let's talk about approaches to value. Most of you know that appraisers use 3 primary approaches to value. And so these won't be unfamiliar to you. You have what's known as the income approach to value, the cost approach to value, and the sales comparison approach. Now, there are actually many other ways to value a property, but these 3 methods are the most widely recognized, and they are accepted by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So you can't really go too wrong if you use these. So let's talk about the income approach to value first, because with ADUs, this comes up a lot. Now, again, as I said, there are limitations in Louisville and Lexington, but it's still worth considering if the income approach is a viable method for valuing an ADU. Now, many of you may know that appraisers will often use equations with terms such as a gross rent multiplier to calculate value. It's not a very complicated formula. We figure that market value can be derived by taking the monthly income of a property and multiplying it by the gross rent multiplier. Well, some appraisers may say, well, that's pretty simple, and why can't we just do that with ADUs? Well, there's a few wrinkles here. One of the big problems is that a GRM implicitly contains land value, and an ADU does not have independent land value. It's an improvement to the land, but it's not reflected in a GRM multiplier. Another complication is that for the income approach to work, ideally, you're going to want to have both the house and the ADU rented and all the comparables that you're using with rented houses and rented ADUs. Now, in a market where there's very little data, it's unlikely you're going to find that. And then, as we said, Louisville and Lexington, they're not allowing both units to be rented at this time. So you would have to do a modified form of this equation. I read a paper from the Appraisal Institute where they did, and it got very complicated. They started splitting up the GRM into attributions of land, attributions of the ADU. I could tell you, if you stick an equation like that into an appraisal report, whether it be for a lender or even for a private party, they're going to scratch their heads, and you're probably going to have to do a lot of explaining, and they may not accept your conclusions. So it's not an approach that I'm recommending at this time. And for commercial appraisers out there who might be listening in, there is something that they use that could theoretically be applied to the income approach for an ADU. It's called discounted cash flow analysis. It's kind of a fancy term, but really what that is doing, it's trying to figure out the present value of a dollar. The idea is a dollar in your hand right now is worth more than the promise of a dollar in the future. And so you could theoretically project the income stream from an ADU, and then you can do a present value. But again, it's not always accepted by lenders. And residential appraisers are generally not trained on how to use discounted cash flow analysis. So you'll probably never see it in a residential report. There's also a couple of other challenges with the income approach. One is that it can be complex to apply to ADUs, and it often overstates the value. And the reason for that is that ADUs are not just built for income generation in mind. It's true, some people do build it for that very reason, but some people build it for generational living. Maybe it's kind of a failure to launch situation, right? Son moves out, doesn't make it big and comes back, and maybe to keep everything status quo, he's in the ADU rather than the main house. And so, there's a correlation, but there's not an exact causation between income generation and the value of an ADU. Another problem that I see is that ADUs can be grossly under-rented. This is actually a problem for the income approach for properties that are like 2 units. It's not as much of a problem for 3 and 4 units and up, but small residential income properties, oftentimes when I talk to clients, when I'm valuing such properties, I'll say, hey, what are you charging for rent for this? And my jaw drops because they may be hundreds and hundreds of dollars below market rent. In fact, I just did one where I was speaking to a representative of an estate. And when she told me the rental amounts, she said, yeah, I know. I got so upset when I found out, the estate holder wasn't raising the rents over the years. So you might get this GRM if you can find the data, and then it's like giving you this low indication of value because maybe they were grossly under rented. So that's one of the complications. And as I mentioned, finding that rental data, it's like finding a needle in a haystack in some markets. Okay, so cost approach, income approach can be sort of helpful, but maybe not reliable. What about the cost approach? Cost approach isn't bad, but appraisers have an expression: cost does not equal value. And a good example of this is swimming pools. Now, I started appraising in sunny California. And in that state, you can add tens of thousands of dollars or even 100,000 plus in value to a property with a really nice swimming pool, nice concrete decking around it, maybe a little pool, storage area, a shower outside. You can add some value to your property with pools. But in cold, rainy Oregon, where I live right now, I have had situations where a property had a pool. I talked to the agent. Oh yeah, they're just going to backfill it. They're yanking it right out. So that person probably spent 50, 60, 70,000 putting that pool in, but in the Portland market, it just didn't return much or any value. Now, I'm not saying someone's going to buy a property with an ADU in Louisville or Lexington and then just tear down the ADU. That's not going to happen. An ADU is very useful, but it is quite likely that the cost of building that ADU may not be fully recaptured in the market. And so I would say that appraisers could probably look at the cost approach as kind of like a ceiling of value. And so, we know that there may be a discount that the market would apply to it, but we definitely want to be mindful of it because these ADUs can be quite expensive. Now, I'm going to show you something from my market here. Now, this is Portland, Oregon. So Louisville, Lexington could be quite different in prices. Now, before COVID hit, in 2019, we have living in our city in Portland, a national ADU expert. His name's Cole Peterson. And he puts on these tours of ADUs that he helped to get the project started and to completion. So I actually took that tour in 2019. He gives you a brochure and just look at the prices that people were spending to make their ADUs. This was attached new construction, $157,000. They finished that ADU in 2017. Another attached one to a townhome, $126,000. Detached new construction, $203,000. Garage conversion, $150,000. This one, my jaw hit the floor. Basement conversion, $380,000. Now, actually, when I saw that on the brochure, I said, this is one I have to go walk inside. It was awesome. The guy spared no expense. And when I was talking to him, I said, you realize that if you try to get an appraisal for this, it's not going to return this value. He said, yeah, I know, I don't care. He just wanted to go over the top with his conversion. But could you imagine $380,000? And he did this in 2016 for basement conversion. So these things can get really expensive. And second page, same thing. The cheapest one on this entire list was a basement conversion, which shows you the variability. This one only cost $70,000. So prices vary. And we have to keep in mind as appraisers that these ADUs, they are a substantial investment in money. So while we stress to people that cost does not equal value, I often tell appraisers that if you're going to put in a report that a $200,000 ADU is only contributing $10,000, and I have seen that, to total value of the property, that better be one awesome report. And awesome is in bold, it's in colors, because that's how awesome that report should be. It should be a report that the Library of Congress wants to archive for future generations of appraisers to study, because wow, you're going to have to do some explaining why this huge investment is only giving such a pitiful return in value. But there are challenges, and we have to be mindful of that. And so a number of challenges with the cost approach include just getting reliable cost figures. Appraisers, we do use national cost estimating manuals. We do use software, but sometimes we can reach out to local builders, but getting reliable figures for ADU construction in your market can be hard. And it is important to realize that the smaller a dwelling, the higher the cost per square foot. And sometimes the price per square foot for ADUs can get really high in comparison to the main dwelling. And of course, it depends on how elaborate, how complicated the ADU is, and they differ quite a bit. And another big problem is something called depreciation, right? How much wear and tear there is, how much it's been devalued by time. And sometimes the difference in depreciation between a house and the ADU is extreme. I have appraised properties where you're getting an ADU and a house is just thrown in as a bonus because the main house is just awful. And so that can make an appraiser pluck some hairs out, turn some hairs gray, trying to figure out how to account for that. It can be challenging. And so for any appraiser who's listening on this presentation, appraising an ADU, especially in a market with little data, it's a complex appraisal. And you may need to charge appropriately for your time because you don't want to rush these appraisals. You need to dig in deep. Finally, there's something called functional obsolescence. That's just another fancy term for the market's penalty for the design of the improvements. And you have to figure that out. There's probably going to be some functional obsolescence. And people may say, well, why is that? It's because unless something's returning dollar for dollar for what you spent in the market, in the increase in value of the entire property, then implicitly the market is giving you a penalty. So we talked about those pools, right? There is a functional obsolescence for pools in most markets, even in most parts of California. What you put in, you may not get out. And so that's probably going to be the case in Louisville. I know ADUs are kind of just getting off the ground in Louisville and Lexington, but just a gut instinct from appraising these properties, it seems to be very unlikely you're going to be able to see a dollar for dollar return in what you're putting in. And so figuring out what that market penalty is, it could be difficult if there's little to no local data. So again, take your time with these assignments, look for the data. We'll talk a little bit about how to obtain that in just a bit, but you are going to have a challenge on your hands. Now, in my opinion, sales comparison approach is where most appraisers are going to live and breathe with the valuation of ADUs. But even the sales comparison approach is not without its challenges because there are differences. ADUs are just like houses. They differ immensely from each other in style, in quality, utility, and appeal. And another problem that may come up is something known as a confounding variable. So, okay, you got this ADU, but maybe it's not the only unusual feature for this property, right? Maybe there's also a pool, there's some big storage buildings, maybe a large shop. Maybe the property is on a large lot, an unusually large lot for the area. So if you have the ADU and then you have all these other variables that in and of themselves would be extremely difficult to isolate, yeah, you know, it could be very difficult figuring out the contributory value. So the sales comparison approach isn't a panacea per se, but it's probably the best approach we as appraisers have. For that reason, I do think that the sales comparison approach is the gold standard for ADU valuation. Now, I know appraisers will often cite lack of comparables, sometimes even in Portland, where I don't think that excuse really holds as much. We'll still get appraisers saying there are no comparables, there are no comparables. Well, just keep in mind that the GSEs, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, they have guidelines, but they're not the 10 Commandments. You are allowed to modify the guidelines if the valuation at hand warrants it. So here are some examples of what you may have to do. Now, time parameters. The ideal appraisal would contain at least 3 similar sales that close within the last 90 days located on the same street. So if you were an appraiser and you could get 3 comps close within the last 90 days located on the same street as the subject, you're in heaven. I mean, that, you know, you can't get much better than that. Now, things are, of course, seldom ideal with ADU analysis. So what may you have to do? You may have to go back in time. You may have to use comparables that sold 24, 36 months ago. I've had appraisals that were complex where I've had to use comps that sold over 5 years ago. And I had to call the agent and we talked about it and they remembered it because it was a weird one. That's why I'm using a comp from 5 years ago. And we had a nice conversation and put it in the report. It's a guideline. Now, we also have a technique known as price indexing trend analysis. So if your property sold years ago when the market was about right here, and we know that the market's been hot and now the market's up here, you can do mathematical formulas that will help you to adjust comparables and make sure that you reflect the increase in valuation with time. I do that with just about every report that I do. If you're an appraiser, there are plenty of classes, plenty of resources to help you to do that. Another technique an appraiser could use is what's known as resale analysis. Now, if your property that has that ADU sold multiple times on the open market with that ADU, you can say, hey, you know, every time this property sold on the market, it looks like compared to competing properties at that time, the value the ADU contributed was X%. Perfectly valid way of extracting value. Sometimes the best comparable is the subject itself. Now you want to be careful with this. You don't want to just lean on that. But of course, we're talking about situations where data is scarce. You're kind of turning over every rock. It could be the leg of a stool for an argument of value that you're building. And I've used this technique in appraisal reports before, and you don't really get much pushback as long as you're explaining what you're doing. I remember an appraiser, a colleague of mine, he had an expression: you can get away with murder as long as you explain yourself in the general text addendum. So you definitely want to make sure you're giving verbose analysis and you're helping people to understand how you arrived at your conclusions. Now, I know that since Louisville and Lexington are kind of getting their ADUs off the ground, you may not have a lot of comps in the immediate area, so you may have to do a location adjustment. So don't feel like you have to stay just within your competing neighborhood or market area. If there's absolutely no data, you are allowed to actually go outside the immediate area and say, well, there are no ADUs here, but I did find a few in this area, that area. And then what you have to do is you have to calculate a location adjustment. So you might look at the aggregate price differences between the two communities. And you might say, okay, in Louisville, a 1,500 square foot home on a 0.10 of an acre lot generally sells for this price. In this city where the ADU was located, it looks like it sells for X percentage above or below. Okay, now you can use that comp in the report and you can make an adjustment for the location differences. This one right here is kind of a break glass in case of emergency situation. So if you have a very dissimilar property, but it had an ADU and you just can't find what you would call a comparable, you could use that dissimilar property or two that had an ADU. Then you can say, okay, comparing these properties to properties that are competitive to them, what was the increase in value, the percentage increase in value for that ADU? You're trying to kind of tease out from the market a percentage adjustment. You get that adjustment, then you could apply it to the subject. You may not even grid these dissimilar properties. You may just talk about them in the general text addendum, but you're helping the person figure out where you got that percentage adjustment. Document it in the report so people are not left scratching their head where you came up with the percentage. And so I just want to show appraisers are not limited to just one or two valuation techniques. We have like a carpenter, we have a toolbox, and you can do all kinds of analyses: aggregate differences, double, triple scatter plots, linear regression, multiple regression, correlation matrices, correlograms, paired sale analysis. There are so many techniques. Some are more usable than others. They're more readily applied than others, but you're not just limited to one or two methodologies. And this is just a kind of a mashup of different techniques. You may not see these in most appraisal reports. I tend to be sparing putting in, this is a correlation matrix. I only put that in if it really is required. Don't want to confuse people either. But if you have in your work file how you arrived at the value, then you can kind of just put the cliff notes in the report. And then of course, if you have a question, you say, hey, I have the data. I'm gonna show you a quick example of something that I just used in an appraisal report. I think I might have just finished this week. This is what's known as a triple scatter plot. Now I had a property, nicely updated, but it was directly across the street from a middle school. And when I mean directly across the street, I mean the car entry to the middle school was like, you could just see it from the porch. So very noisy, and that street was a bus route. So I noticed that the subject had sold a few times over the years. This is going all the way back to like 2007. So I said, let me look at properties competitive to the subject. So the gray dots are properties that are very similar in property metrics. And I noticed that whenever the subject sold, it was near the bottom of the vertical time slice, right? So you would look up to see something that sold on a particular date. So this helped me to see that whenever this property across the street from the school went on the market, it pretty much sold at the bottom of the market. And I had a comp that had a similar location, but I suspected that that comp was worse than the subject. And sure enough, that comp sold a few times on the open market. And if you notice, these didn't sell too far apart, and the market broadly was going up, but this green dot here, which was comp 2 in the report, it sold lower. So I was able to get my location adjustments. So you could do the same thing with an ADU. You might have some data in the market where you can find that this property with the ADU sold a few times, but maybe the ADU dot is up here. And then you can start figuring out, well, relative to the market, whenever this thing sold with the ADU, it seems like it contributed, 50, 60, 70, 80, $100,000 in value. Let me tell you something. You put something like this in a report, no one's going to argue with you because it's just cold, hard facts. You can't argue with data. I always like to plug this book. I don't know the author personally. I don't get a royalty for plugging it, but I think every appraiser should have this book in their toolkit. It's called Appraising the Tough Ones, Creative Ways to Value Complex Residential Properties. Very good book. Put it in your library. It has some very creative ways that you could figure out the value of something that's unusual for the market. So let's talk about searching for ADUs. Now, I'm in Portland, so I'm going to have to give this from the perspective of Portland, but the principles are similar. You want to be creative when you look for comps. You have to look everywhere for the data. So I encourage everyone to study their local MLS system. For you assessors, hopefully you have a system that allows you to code for ADUs because you really do want to be able to search for the sales of these properties in any database that you're using. And in my MLS system called RMLS, here are some of the codes that I learned to look for that might, not always, but might indicate that an ADU was present on the property. So of course, this first one is self-explanatory, but this one right here, that stands for guest quarters. This next one, separate living quarters, second kitchen. So I have learned where those codes appear in my export. And our export has hundreds of columns of data, so I've had to do a deep dive into it. But I've built some custom spreadsheets and custom tools that will check wherever these codes might appear, and it will flag and help me to quickly isolate where a potential comp could be. Now, sometimes it's not an ADU. That's why I said it may be an indicator, but that's where appraisers have to do what's known as desk reviewing. Sometimes when I'm looking for an ADU, I quickly can whittle it down to likely candidates, and then I'm just sifting through a lot of data. I mean, it really sometimes just comes down to just good old-fashioned hard work where you're sitting at your desk for a few hours searching through a mountain of properties to find those comps. And again, if you're an appraiser, don't bid these out like you do a normal quickie ranch property, right? These are more complex. Another technique that I use as well is that I know how to search the agent remarks. So you might want to start compiling a list in your market. What are the synonyms, the terms that people use for ADUs? Of course, you're going to search for ADU, accessory dwelling unit, but maybe granny flats, guest cottage, apartment, auxiliary dwelling unit. Sometimes if your MLS system kind of separates out single family from duplexes, you may have to do a search in the 2-unit properties because an agent might have stuck it there, even though technically speaking, it's a single family home with an accessory unit. So they could be hiding there. You may have to search Zillow. That's, Zillow sometimes is kind of a bad word in the appraisal industry, but actually it's okay. It could be a resource for finding data. Redfin as well, Craigslist, sometimes these things will appear there. For sale by owner, FSBO websites. If you have them in Louisville and Lexington, check them. Maybe some of these properties have an ADU. I've talked to appraisers that when they're appraising a property that is extremely hard to comp out, they're looking at assessor's records for anything that's sold. They're looking at aerials. Some of these appraisers said that they've even knocked on people's doors. You don't want to do that in the COVID environment, But one appraiser said that whenever he was desperate for data and he had to kind of knock on doors for maybe a home that sold privately, didn't sell on the open market, but you can see from the assessor's records, it did sell to another person. He'd come up to a door with a $10 gift card to Starbucks, business card, and would just talk to the new owner, try to get some details about the sale. Again, you're only doing something like that if there's just no data. I mean, you are just really digging in deep. My instinct is that I'm sure there's something out there in Louisville and Lexington, even if it was built before the current code. So you'll probably find a few comps. And the good news is now that Louisville and Lexington are really working hard to get these ADUs into the housing stock, this problem will eventually disappear, right? This isn't your life for all of eternity. This may be your life for the first few of these ADU appraisals, but eventually more and more of these structures will be built. They will start to resell. They will be populated into your local MLS database as comparables. And then a very complex appraisal starts to become a moderately complex appraisal, starts to become, just an appraisal with a slight complication in the future. So I think we should just spend maybe a few minutes before we get to the Q&A, just looking at some actual case studies in ADU valuation. It's always nice to see actual examples, I think. So Portland has a list of permitted ADUs. That list isn't 100% exhaustive, but it's pretty big. It's about, I think the last time I checked, there's like 4,000 entries. Now, not each one of those is an ADU, but it's got quite a few entries. And of course, not every project that applied for a permit actually completed. But what we did was we just said, okay, we got properties that were permitted with ADUs. We got the address. Which one of these properties sold on the open market through the local MLS after the ADU was added? That's a great way, by the way, if you're an appraiser, you could kind of start doing your own local market studies. And you can say, okay, I'm going to keep track of this. And by the way, I think I did see Louisville does have a link on one of their pages where you actually can see some of the permits for ADUs. It's not a very long list because I guess, it's just getting started. But if I were an appraiser, I would bookmark that page and I would periodically be checking it, because you could then check and see if the property sold after the ADU was added to get an idea of what the market is giving for that ADU. So here's an example. We just, looked at that list and then sold an RMLS after. As you can see, yes, yes, yes. Most of them didn't. So it may take time for a database to populate. But Portland's had very favorable ADU regulations for a long time. And so when I went through the list, I stayed within the city. Here's a pin map of the resales. Now, I know some of you appraisers might be salivating like, whoa, I wish we had this many resales. But what's funny is appraisers, even in Portland, still complain that there are no comps. There are comps. I mean, clearly there are comps. These every pin you see here is a property that had an ADU added and it then sold through the MLS system. So it was exposed to the open market. So let's take a look at a few of these. Here's property one, detached garage conversion. This one, the home sold in 2018. You can see the ADU back there. So this one, the ADU added 18% to the value, but there's a wrinkle because where there was a garage, there's no longer a garage. So you have to factor in the net loss in value for losing that garage. So in this case, it took 6% off that and you had a final value gain of 12%. That was the net gain. And so here's that ADU. So you can see it's pretty nice. It's a two-level one. Like again, most of the time when people build these ADUs, they're gonna have a nice structure in their hands. And remembering our definition of ADUs, independent, check, right? You don't have to interact with this tenant if they live in this. Independent cooking facilities, bathing facilities, meets all the check marks. And I believe this one was under 800 square feet. So if we could scoop this property up, drop it in Louisville or Lexington, I don't think they would be given a hard time for permitting. I think it would pass. Here's another one, property 2. This one was a detached garage conversion ADU. Now this one sold in 2017. In this case, the ADU added 28.3%, so higher. But again, we lost the garage, so we did lose some value, and that dropped it down to 17.2%. So you'll find as an appraiser, when you do these type of studies, you're not going to get one consistent number. You're going to get a cluster of values, which probably will tend towards a reliable figure, but there's always going to be variation when you do studies like this. And so here's that particular ADU. This one was another 2-level one. So we got our kitchen, lower level, kind of a living room area down here, and it even has its own bedroom back there. So again, very nice structure. Certainly, if a young couple rented this, right, I think it would serve them nicely for people just starting out in the housing market. So it certainly has a good value and appeal, and you could command some nice rents for a property like that. Let's go to another one. Now, this one shows how sometimes the ADUs may not really add that much value, because this was a property, it was very recent construction. This one sold in 2017. The ADU was small, really small. It's only 264 square feet. And it got to the edge of measurability of contributory value. Careful analysis. Thankfully, because this was such a new construction, I was able to look at properties with very little depreciation. So you could see that, yeah, the ADU is adding something, but it was a pretty small increase in value. It was just 3.6%. And when you look at it, you kind of understand why. So again, we do meet the test of independence. This one's over this garage, and it does have an independent way of getting in. You don't have to walk through the garage, right? You can come around here, come up the spiral staircase, come in through the door. But look at this particular ADU. It's got a bathroom in the back. It's kind of a studio. And you can tell just by looking at it, the quality is not quite as high as the other two we were just looking at, right? Not bad, but the quality is a little bit more basic. So again, the value will be correlated to quality as well as size. Now here's a property of an attached ADU. So this one's a little different. So they didn't convert a garage. They just added to one section of the house, and they built a new structure. So the attached ADU was built in 2015. The home sold in 2018 with that attached ADU. And in this case, it was about a 25% bump up in value. And then the dollar amount for that time was about $125,000. So that's a substantial increase in value, right? Here's the property. As we said, it may not return dollar for dollar. They probably spent a minimum of 150, maybe even 200 in the Portland metro area to build this. So it didn't give you dollar for dollar, but 125K, that's a pretty substantial bump up in value to a property. And in this one, you can see again, very nicely done, but the quality, appliances are kind of basic. Flooring looks like it's laminate. Countertops, nothing really special here. So maybe it would have been a little bit higher value if they had put some higher end finishes, but that's, according to taste and according to budget. But certainly it added a substantial dollar figure. So you could imagine if you were a homeowner, you spent 150K, 200K to build this thing, and some appraiser came along and said, yeah, it only adds $10,000 in value. Whew. Yeah, there's going to be some words exchanged, because that's not right. Another example, this is one where it was two homes essentially. This is where I say it gets a little bit ambiguous. The ADU and the main house were very similar in size. So the ADU was built in 2016. The main house was 866 square feet. ADU was 690 square feet. Look at the contributory value, 71.2%. But that's not that shocking, because they essentially put another house on the lot. So we said the ADU doesn't have land value, so that's why it's not maybe 100% increase, right? But basically, they were close to doubling the value of this property by putting a second house in. So here was the main house, which, it was okay. But here was the ADU. And in this case, this was where I was talking about, you buy an ADU, you get a house thrown in. ADU blows the main house out of the water. I don't have a picture of the main house in here, but this was the ADU. and it's just way nicer than the main house. And this is where you might be scratching your head trying to figure out, man, how do I account for the depreciation between the various structures? But in a situation like this, what you can do is you can pretend the ADU does not exist, okay? Imagine the ADU does not exist. What would this house have sold for without it, right? And then you can start bringing in properties with ADUs, and that can help you to triangulate the contributory value of the ADU when the house may not be that great. Again, gets complex. You might be spending some time on these things, but that's what they're paying you for, a quality analysis. This one was a basement ADU. This one added 16.5% of value. And as you can see, this one was pretty nice. Nice countertops, stainless steel appliances, segmented rooms. That's always kind of nice when you have ADUs, when it's not just a studio. So this one added quite a bit in value. Property 7, also a basement ADU, but remember how we talked about carve out units? So this one was not the entire basement, because in Portland, they really do hard cap you at 800 square feet. So this basement was 1,080 square feet. So they just elected to convert about half of the basement. So that's why the value increase was only about 6%, because you weren't converting the entire basement to an ADU. And keep in mind that when you analyze this, that you have the same problem you have with a garage conversion, right? Let's say you convert your ADU, your basement into an ADU, and then you rent it out. Well, you just lost the use of 1,080 square feet of space, right? You don't have that anymore. So sometimes you have to figure in the net loss in value. It's going to return something most likely, but you may have to keep in mind that, yeah, you don't have a basement anymore, at least not while it's rented. So that's a kind of a wrinkle to keep in mind. Here's the ADU. Again, nice, decent countertops, nice flooring, cadet heaters there. And by the way, if you're going to call it an ADU, I'm sure Louisville and Lexington have this rule: there better be an egress window. And it can't be, I was at one house recently where the window was way high. A person should not have to be Kareem Abdul-Jabbar to get out of a burning building. If they have to be 7 feet tall to get out, it's not an ADU, because a person should be able to, of average height, to break a window and get out and save their life in case of a fire. So always make sure you're paying attention to the height and width of windows, whether they're present. I always try to make a note of that, because if there were no windows in this unit, even if it had this kitchen, even if it had this bedroom, it's not an ADU, because Fannie Mae is going to reject it. There would be no way to get out except a staircase that could be potentially blocked depending on the unit. So keep that in mind. Got to have that egress window. All right, let's look at it one last one, then we'll maybe take some questions if you have any. So this one is property number 8, another basement ADU. This home sold in 2018. As you can see, the above ground space is considerable, right? So this is a nice house in a pretty nice neighborhood. Sold for, the ADU added about 16% to value, but because this was an expensive neighborhood, just even that 16% almost was $100,000. So again, as an appraiser, we want to be very mindful of just how much these structures could add to the value, because we don't want to kill a deal. We appraisers don't like that expression sometimes, but if someone put a lot of effort, a lot of work, a lot of money, a lot of time into building these, and we don't do a proper analysis, and we come up with some really low figure that isn't even really supported by the market data, that has real world consequences. It could derail a loan. It could create problems for people. We want to make sure we're giving them a rock solid valuation, rock solid. And when we do that, the appraisal profession benefits, the local community benefits, because financing is available. People in the market start to say, hey, you can get some money for these things. That could in turn translate to people being more willing to build them, even though the projects can get complex. And everyone just benefits. It's what's known as a virtuous circle. So that's the interior of it. Again, pretty nice. You got your egress windows, stainless steel appliances, nice flooring. They did a great job with the conversion for this. You can see why it would add such a nice value. Depending on the neighborhood, you rent that out, you could cash flow your mortgage in some cases, or a substantial portion of your mortgage with the rental income you can get from these. So that's the presentation. I know we went really fast. I'm sorry, but I just wanted to make sure I gave you some decent information, covered a few important things. But of course, we can't cover it all in just 50 minutes or so. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me, call me. Always happy to talk shop with anyone. But I'm happy to take any basic questions you have now, if there are any.
Great. Well, thanks, Abdur. This is a perfect example of why we hosted this conference in the first place, was to get professionals in the different fields who know exactly what they're talking about. Planners can talk about accessory dwelling units, but as far as getting into the weeds and some of the stuff that people really need to know about in order for it to become a reality, it's something that we rely on folks like you to present. So thank you for that. And anybody who references a triple scatter plot obviously knows what I'm talking about. But yeah, so thanks for providing some practical solutions that we can take away. There were a couple of questions that were brought up, and we've got just a couple of minutes here, so we'll hit all we can. Going back to a point that you had sort of towards the beginning of your presentation, you talked about under renting. So the question is, isn't under renting ADUs a social plus? It makes ADUs more affordable than renting at market rates, and affordable housing has far more demand than it has supply. So is it valuable in a social sense to encourage people to hike up their rents?
Well, absolutely. I mean, from a social perspective, if I know if I needed a place to live and someone's willing to rent a beautiful ADU to me for $1, I'd be thrilled, right? But then the flip side of that is that when the person goes to sell the property, it may not command a lot of value in the marketplace. So we typically say a home is the biggest investment someone's ever going to make in their life. And if they throw an ADU on top of it, that may be the second biggest investment. So you would want there to be some benefit in terms of monetary increase of the property for adding that ADU. Otherwise, I think the disincentive to build one would be a lot stronger than the social good. And that could create a problem where there's not enough units on the market.
That's a great perspective on that question. Abdur, could I ask you real quick to stop the share of your screen?
Sure thing. There you go.
All right. And the next question that's come up is specific to short-term rentals, which I'm sure is a question you get a lot. But in Louisville, I think they've banned them outright in ADUs, and in Lexington, it's a conditional use permit to do. But how do, in general, or in our specific instances, how would short-term rentals of ADUs factor into an appraisal?
So most likely it's going to be Airbnb, right? So let's take that as an example. Airbnb, a lot of times you have to apply for business license with the local municipality, and then you have to have it advertised on the Airbnb website. So what you're really asking an appraiser to do is assess the going concern business value. That's very different than residential valuation. So there are commercial appraisers that specialize in that work. They can look at the revenue stream for an Airbnb. Maybe you have years of constant rentals, and yeah, they can say, this is the value of that. But that's not residential. And remember, most people are going to be getting a loan from Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. They don't allow that.
Well, and that's simply the point of the regulations and restrictions that were put in place, is that we're pursuing ADUs as a measure for long-term housing solutions. So that answer fits right into that. Okay, the next question we have is that, financial value aside, could other livability indicators be included in valuation, such as the availability of a more affordable form of housing, proximity to amenities, and then what are the implications of that?
So what basically the questioner is asking is there a location premium? Well, we all know what the three most important things of real estate is, right? Location, location, location. So if you got a home with an ADU and it's right next to the local college and kids are desperate to rent something near the college, that's a location premium. If you're near shopping, amenities, entertainment, that's a location premium, but that should be reflected in the comparables you're using that are in similar locations.
Right. Very good. Okay. One in here is related to off-street parking. So how much does a dedicated off-street parking space or availability of off-street parking for an ADU factor into the appraisal, if at all? I know you've mentioned garage access and those sorts of things, but off-street parking, how does that affect it?
Well, I think in Portland, we've pretty much eliminated the requirement for additional off-street parking for an ADU. And if I recall correctly, you have fairly generous provisions in your local code in Louisville and Lexington as well. You're not trying to make it extremely difficult with the parking requirements. So obviously, if I can take my car off the street, that's usually preferable. And so again, this is where it gets into those comparables, right? Can you tease out the value of being able to put that car off the street or even in a garage?
All right, kind of rapid fire through here since we're running short on time. Universal design or ADA accessibility, does that factor into an appraisal?
So it can be a quality issue. So depending on the design, you may have to do some extra work to make sure that wheelchair access is there. In my personal practice, those are kind of specialty appraisals, ADA access, because most homes by definition are just not going to have it. So the appraiser may have to just simply lean a little heavier on the cost approach, like how much extra did you spend to put this here? Maybe try to see if there's a demonstrable market for it. And then they're going to just have to reconcile how much that's increasing the value, if at all, maybe a wash.
Right, and sort of segueing into tracking construction costs. So how can a homeowner acting as a general contractor help their appraisal as it relates to tracking their construction costs?
Hand over the figures, give them the spreadsheet. Don't keep it a mystery, right? Don't make it a top state secret. Show them what you spent. Impress upon the appraiser, hey, I spent $250,000. And you could even concede, I know it may not return dollar for dollar, but we did spend $200,000 on this. Some appraisers, sadly, are not very well educated on how much it costs to build these things. They're not quite dialed in, and they may kind of, with their ignorance, not value it highly because they thought maybe you only spent $50,000.
Well, and one sort of wrap up question, appraisers in this area, you've given us a lot of practical solutions about, how to tackle this. But again, it's a new product. If you had one sort of takeaway for all the appraisal professionals on the call, what would that be for them? Advice for them?
Dig for the market data. You'd be surprised what's actually out in the market. I bet you if I had access to Louisville and I did some keyword searches, I probably would find guest cottage, maybe a smaller home with a slightly bigger home. There are proxies for valuing ADUs, even if maybe officially the ADU market's just kicking off. There are certainly something in that database you could use. You could put in a report and explain to a lender why you're giving so much value to that ADU.
Great. Well, Abdur, thank you so much. Like I said, this was very enlightening for us, and I know all the folks on the call appreciate the information as well. Again, I want to thank everybody who is joining us and has been here all morning. We've got another day worth of presentations for you tomorrow. And our first session is going to be at 8:30 tomorrow. We're going to be talking about lending. So what are the lending options for ADUs? We're going to be joined by Milton Manolis, who is going to provide some insight on this. Again, I want to thank the City of Louisville for partnering with us on this. This has been a great event so far, day one. AARP Kentucky for your support and partnership on that. And then again, thank you to the audience for you all joining us today. So.